Hello, my name is Luís and I'm here with Valério for part 2 of Inferring Causality. So in the previous session, Valério explained how to perform an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, but right now we are going to do something different, which is we still want to infer causality, but now let's say we don't have the tools to pick a group of people, randomize, following them for 5 years, where we are giving an intervention to half of them and no intervention to the other. We don't have that, so how do we do? And let's say we have a lot of data sets out there, and we want to explore those data sets to try to infer causality. What can we do about them? Well, first, let me just say that there are a lot of methodologies that can be applied to infer causality, but the idea is always the same. You basically want to find or to work things in the data to make two groups that are comparable, where one of the groups is kind of receiving some type of intervention or policy and the other is not receiving any intervention or not being affected by any policy. When you do that, it is called a quasi-experimental design. I am going to talk about only one of those, probably the most famous ones, which is called difference in differences. Now, the thing about differences in differences is that you are going to see it's very, very, very similar to a randomized controlled trial. You have to go to the data, you have to kind of check some boxes, be sure that the data follows a certain criteria, and then you will have also your treatment group and your control group, and you will compare both. I have here a graphical illustration. The idea of a difference in differences is that you have two groups that you can observe in the data. You can observe them before some policy implementation or before some intervention, and you can observe them after. The idea is that before the intervention, they have a very similar pattern. So if you see, you have the green line, which we'll call the green group, and then you have the blue line, which we will call the blue group. So the idea is that they follow similar trends before a policy intervention. Okay, they are different. Look, they have this difference here in yellow, this brownish yellow, but they follow more or less the same tendency. The difference is constant across time. Now, what you find in this graph is that after the intervention, one of the groups continue with more or less the same tendency, in this case, the green group, but the other group decreases a lot the tendency after the intervention. So let's say that this was the problem that Valério introduced to you with smoking and with some, let's say, policy that affects smoking that is implemented to decrease the amount of smoking. So we have here consuming tobacco, and you have that both groups are with the same trend, always the same difference, but then the blue group, instead of continuing with more or less the same trend as the green group, it decreases. What we can say in this case is that, okay, this part of the difference was already expected, right? Because they already had more or less this difference before the policy implementation. But this new red part, this new difference is new. It's most likely because of the intervention. And this is the idea of a differences in differences, is that before some intervention or before some policy is implemented, you have kind of parallel trends, that's what we call them, where they behave more or less in the same way. And then after the implementation of a policy that only affects one of the groups, that group that is affected changes the pattern, but the other that is not affected doesn't change the pattern. The way to compute this causality of the policy is precisely to compute this red line. So in this case, it would be the green post minus the blue post. So all this difference, the black difference, minus this difference that was already there. So the green pre-intervention minus the blue pre-intervention. So if you subtract this difference to all of the black line, you basically get the red line. What we need, you kind of can see it by the graph, right? You will need first longitudinal data where you can observe both groups before and after. You also need to find, of course, a group that was subject to the intervention or the policy and a group that was not subject to the intervention or the policy. Then you need to confirm that neither of them received any other intervention in an environment where the only thing that happened was that one of the groups received the intervention and nothing else happened. And then you also need to confirm that the intervention was not caused because of some selection, because of some group was in need of the intervention, and then it might have been the group that caused the intervention to be applied to them, which would mean they are already too different from the other group in the first. In this case, the case of Valerio, the case that he told you in the RCT, it would be quite simple. You would have to go to some data set and find people that were subject to their intervention. Let's say that, for instance, let's pick the USA, which is usually a good example, where you have one state of the USA applying some policy to smoking in this case, and the other next to it did not. So if you have data on both states and you have longitudinal data, you would be able to see if both were more or less similar before the state implementing some policy, and then you could see how they differ after the state implements some policy on smoking. Now, let's see an example. What I did for this example, it's funny because I wrote in Google difference in differences tobacco or smoking, I guess, and this was the one that appeared. So it's a very simple paper. I have never read it. It was by chance. And what they do is the following. They have some policy that they want to evaluate, and the policy is a ban on sales of flavored tobacco, or if you prefer, vaping, in San Francisco, California in 2018. And the outcome that they want to check is the propensity of smoking, but smoking tobacco, not vaping. So it's very interesting because they want to see how a ban in vaping is going to affect tobacco. This is very interesting because it explores a concept in economics which is called substitutability. So they believe that if you put a ban on vaping, maybe there's a chance that people will start consuming more tobacco. So the treatment group are young people less than 18 years old living in San Francisco. The control groups are young people with less than 18 years old living in other districts. Now, in terms of the data, what they use is a longitudinal data from a survey, which is the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, which is a biennial school district survey. So it takes place from 2 to 2 years. What they find is the following. They have these where the smoking in San Francisco is basically the same as in the other districts. But then remember that intervention is somewhere here in 2018. So in 2017, it was basically the same as the other districts. But then in 2019, the next time they observe it, it is much higher than the other districts. They believe because there was a smoking ban on vaping, the young people in San Francisco started substituting vaping for more tobacco, so which would be harmful in that sense. So there's here a negative externality, which is quite strange and quite interesting. On the ban of vaping, you ban vaping, so they now smoke more. Okay, and that is something important that you would have to have into account as a policymaker. Now, there may be several flaws in terms of this study. For instance, they don't have a follow-up, so you don't know if this is persistent or not. You can argue that maybe some other districts are not super comparable to San Francisco, but you still have some very good parallel trends before the policy. But yeah, okay, you could then try to find problems with this. With a quasi-experimental study, you will always be subject to some criticism. So there's always things that people will say that may not give you the full answer. So the job of the researcher that is doing, for instance, a difference in differences in this case, is to try to show in whatever way is necessary that yes, the groups are comparable, yes, there's no other intervention taking place, yes, you should be able to believe that this is causal. That's it for today. Don't smoke, not good for your health. We'll see each other some next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.